Happy Lord's Day, everybody, and welcome back to our study of 1 Corinthians. Our text this week is in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, the first 6 verses. So join me as we read from the word together. Now concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, but because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer. But then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now, as a concession, not a command, I say this. So we've reached a point in the letter where Paul he's kind of shifting gears, although it's definitely possible to overstate that. Because up to this point, Paul has been addressing reports that he has received from other people, from third parties, about the church's behavior in Corinth. So this is not stuff that they've told him. This is stuff that he has heard from Chloe's household and from some messengers that have been sent to him. And notice, by the way, he addresses all of those things pretty frankly and bluntly, right? He doesn't really stop to say, have you guys really been doing this? The tone of it is, this is shocking, and how dare you guys do this? But now Paul is shifting his attention away from those reports to a letter that Corinth has written him, containing some questions, containing probably some assertions. So he's switching gears in one sense, but in an important sense, Paul is continuing with what he has been writing about. All right, so the reports that we read about earlier have included all sorts of sordid behavior. Reports of factionalism, of a man who has been sleeping with his stepmother, of brothers taking each other to court, of just general tolerance for hiring prostitutes. Again, all kinds of sordid behavior. Paul is not exactly going to change topics, at least not immediately. He is going to transition to some other topics, but a lot of the same ideas that we have seen from the early part of the letter are going to keep resurfacing, particularly this idea of factionalism, how the church isn't really unified, how they consider themselves, how basically they're puffed up and arrogant and consider themselves to be wise and spiritual, and how they have allowed that kind of arrogance to make it where they're leaving other people in the dust in terms of their faith, and doing things that violate each other's conscience. So all of these ideas are going to keep coming back up. But to get us into the letter section, in fact, we get the sense that Paul is not so much interested in shifting from reports to the letter, so much as this is just a convenient time for him to start talking about the letter, because the letter also pertains to some things that he is already talking about. So you'll remember that in our last reading, last week, the end of 1 Corinthians chapter 6, Paul is talking about their use of prostitutes. And of course, he has already talked about some other sexual issues, infamously the man who has his father's wife in 1 Corinthians 5. It even finds its way into the lawsuit discussion in 1 Corinthians 6. He's talking about how brothers are bringing each other before unrighteous judges, and he finishes that discussion off by saying, don't you know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of heaven? And that includes sexually immoral people. So this matter of sexual immorality has It's been something that Paul has been talking about, and he's going to continue talking about it. Right? He's not finished talking about sexual ethics. So, I mean, for better or for worse, I know we've been on this topic in various ways for the last few weeks because that's the way that First Corinthians is going. But we've got at least one more PG-13 rated sermon in this series. So for now, Paul is still writing about sex, this time marital sex. And he's going to use this as a jumping off point for talking about marriage more broadly. So he's not going to spend all of chapter 7 talking about sex, although it's going to keep coming up. But he is going to kind of segue into talking about marriage more broadly. He's going to talk about separations and divorce and the question of whether or not a person should get married in the first place, all kinds of things. But our text today is about sex. We need to begin with a misreading of the text. So before we throw some light on the text, we're going to throw some shadow on the text for reasons that I hope will become apparent as we go along. Mainly because this misreading of the text that we're going to look at is closely akin to the Corinthian belief that Paul is trying to correct in our text today. Now, remember, this happened also with last week's text. The Corinthians had this false notion about the worthlessness and the unimportance of the body. And Paul corrects that at the end of 1 Corinthians 6 by saying, look, the body is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. And God raised the Lord and will raise us up also by his power. All right, so we spent quite a bit of time last week talking about Paul's theology of the body, giving the body its full worth. And we said last week that there are a lot of brethren in modern churches that on that issue at least, are pretty firmly in the Corinthian camp and have managed to read that text from the end of 1 Corinthians 6 and say, you see, the body really is unimportant and worthless, which is exactly the opposite of what Paul is saying. And that's the Corinthian position. They believe because God is going to destroy the body. Remember, their position is food is for the stomach and the stomach's for food, and God will destroy both one and the other. So in other words, your body is destined for the rubbish heap, so it doesn't really matter what you do with it. It's not ultimately going to have an effect on your soul. And we talked last week about how a lot of brethren in modern American churches have held on to at least a significant part of that view. We recognize that what you do with your body has an impact on your immortal soul, but otherwise we agree with the Corinthians that the body is worthless, that it's going to be cast off, and that there's absolutely, that it bears no significance whatsoever. Paul's answer is no, God's going to raise it. Right? God is going to raise your body from the dead. Now, it's going to be transformed, and I don't want to, I guess, re-preach last week's sermon, but I just want to point out, we had this tendency to read things that Paul says in 1 Corinthians and take exactly the opposite lesson out of them, because in these particular issues, we fall within the Corinthian camp, at least that many of us do. At least from my experience in American Churches of Christ, we tend to do the same thing with today's text. Paul addresses a Corinthian misunderstanding about things, and it is not uncommon to find brethren in the churches reading Paul to mean precisely the opposite of what he actually says, because in this we are also in the Corinthian camp. And again, I say we generally, I don't mean literally everybody in modern American Churches of Christ. I just mean this is a view that is very common, and one, in fact, that I was taught growing up, listening to lots and lots and lots of lessons in American Churches of Christ. One thing that doesn't help is that the translators of the English Standard Version have mangled this passage pretty badly in some key spots, and we'll see that as we go along. But our text suggests a few questions that we need to answer. First off, what is this Corinthian position that Paul is answering? All right, so he opens up chapter 7 with, "Now concerning the matters about which you wrote." All right, what did they write? What is the position, either the question or the assertion that Paul is answering? Is it that it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman? Or is it something else? Is Paul saying that for himself? Another question, what is Paul's answer to the Corinthian position? And that can go a long way in helping us determine what exactly the Corinthian position is what kind of answer he gives, how he goes about arriving at that answer. And then finally, in the last verse of our reading today, verse 6, Paul says, "Now, as a concession, not a command, I say this." All right, and the ESV has mangled that a little bit. They've basically reversed the word order of the sentence. "This I say as a concession, not a command." What's this? Is it referring back to something in the previous 5 verses? Is it referring to what Paul's going to say next in verse 7 about how he wishes that everyone were to remain as he is? In other words, single, celibate. But that he understands that not everybody is given that gift. And so he's holding up, what is he holding up as the concession? What is Paul conceding in verse 6? So, like we said, let's start with a misreading that answers these questions in a way that I don't think that really deals sufficiently with the text. The misreading goes, something like this. First off, this misreading of the text says that Paul is speaking for himself when he says, "It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman." And so the way that this misreading of the text understands everything following from that, again, it begins with understanding that Paul is speaking for himself. These are his thoughts. Again, also acknowledging that he is inspired by the Spirit, right? So by saying that they are his thoughts written in this letter, we're also saying this is God's will for man. That it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Begin with that, and then according to this misreading of the text, he continues, "Look, I know that you people are weak. Right? It's good that a man shouldn't have sexual relations with a woman, but because there are temptations to sexual immorality, people should get married. Each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. People ought to get married." So the ideal is that nobody has sex, but we're weak. We can't meet that ideal. So get married. That's in other words, that's basically the concession. And even then, again, the misreading continues in this vein. Even then, the marriage is really just meant as an outlet for sexual temptation that we should be really wary of. That the norm should be, and again, the ideal is that you abstain from sex so that you can focus yourself on the Lord, focus yourself on prayer, as Paul says specifically in this passage. Only really having sex often enough to stave off temptation, to keep Satan from taking advantage of you. And further, again, according to this misreading, Paul says, "Look, I'm saying all of this as a concession, because I'd rather you all be celibate like me, Paul." Now, this misreading rests on several points that we will deal with as we go along. the main thing that I want us to understand about this misreading, and this is the way that I have heard this text taught in modern American churches of Christ repeatedly. The main point of all of this is that this actually is the Corinthian position. This is the way the Corinthians generally understand marital sex. This is what they are saying. And it completely misses Paul's answer to what the Corinthians are saying. So that brings us to that first question that we suggested. What is the Corinthian position? It's what the ESV has put in quotation marks. Now, again, like we said last week, we talked about this slogan problem in 1 Corinthians. How much of it is Paul speaking for himself? How much of it is him quoting what the Corinthians have said back to them? And those quotation marks don't exist in the Greek because there are no quotation marks in Koine Greek. But in short, what the Corinthians believe, what they have written that Paul is answering, is this statement. It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Specifically in view is a man's relationship with his wife. That's something that is difficult to translate over into English sufficiently. Like this idea that the same words for man and woman in this passage also mean husband and wife. Now, Paul is talking about husbands and wives in this passage, right? Each man should have his own wife. Each woman should have her own husband, right? Husbands and wives are in view. And so this is specifically a question about marital sex, not extramarital sex. And that's what this assertion is about. It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, specifically not even his wife. Now, at this point, so that's what I'm saying is that is the Corinthian position, right? They're basically asking, if you wanted to frame it as a question, they're asking, is it good or bad for a man to have sex with his wife? Right now, Paul doesn't frame it as a question. He just states it as an assertion that this is what they've written. It's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, as if that's the answer they've already arrived at, and that's what they're writing to Paul. And at this point, you might be thinking that is crazy, right? Not just from our standpoint, right? That it would just, we might think of it as crazy to question whether it's good or bad for a man to have sex with his wife, for a woman to have sex with her husband. You might think that's crazy from a Corinthian standpoint. Right, wait a minute. We're talking about a church that looked the other way while a man was sleeping with his stepmother. It looked the other way while some members of the church were employing prostitutes. And you mean to tell me that some of these people were prudish about having sex with their own spouses? Well, yeah, that's precisely what I mean to say. It sounds crazy to us, but it is entirely consistent with a particular Roman mindset that we saw in our last reading. If you remember last week, you might remember this guy named Epictetus. He was a Roman Stoic philosopher. He was the guy that we quoted last week as saying, "As to pleasure with women, abstain as far as you can before marriage. But if you do indulge in it, do it in the way which is legitimate," right, referring to prostitutes and slaves. So, in his view, in Epictetus's view, celibacy should be the norm. But he makes this concession to those who have to indulge. The urge is too great, right? If you're going to indulge, Epictetus says, at least do it in a socially acceptable way, in a legal and legitimate way, something that would have been acceptable in Roman society, which would have been hiring a prostitute or having sex with one of your slaves. Now, it's easy for us, because he doesn't bring up prostitutes and slaves explicitly. He just says, do it in the way which is legitimate. It's easy for us to read our Christianity back into Epictetus when he says, abstain as far as you can before marriage. Right? We might think, oh, look, even this pagan says that people should save themselves from marriage. That's not what he's saying. Right? He's not promoting marital purity in the same way that we think about marital purity, the sanctity of the marriage bed. Epictetus is not talking about that. Because here's what Epictetus says about sex generally. He says, when you yield to carnal passion, you must take account not only of this one defeat, but of the fact that you have fed your incontinence and strengthened it. Right, now, he's not just talking about extramarital sex here. He's talking about all sex, including marital sex. He says, when you engage in that, first off, you should consider it a defeat. And it's not just a defeat in that moment. It's a defeat that's setting you up for further defeats down the line. It's setting you up for failure down the line because you have indulged your incontinence, which is a Stoic way of talking about your lack of tranquility, your emotional weakness, your lack of independence, detachment from things. It's a form of weakness, right? If you let yourself react to other things, like sexual urges, but it would also include anger. It would include all kinds of things. Here he's talking about sex. He says, you fed your incontinence, your weakness, your inability to say no to yourself. You have strengthened your incontinence. And he's saying that about all sex, including extramarital sex. And this is not a believer we're talking about. This is a Roman Stoic philosopher. Epictetus's teacher, Musonius Rufus, he had this to say about sex. He says, men who are neither licentious nor wicked must consider only those sexual acts which occur in marriage and which are carried out for the creation of children to be right. So Musonius Rufus is saying that for sex to be legitimate, for it to be acceptable, it not only has to occur within the context of marriage, which we would agree with, but furthermore, it must be for procreation. That it is not a good thing in and of itself. Right? That's generally the Roman Stoic view of sex. Right? Seneca believed basically the same thing, that it's a weakness, it's a defeat. In fact, Seneca called it a plague. Sexual urges are a plague that lives in our bosoms. But it's not just limited to Roman Stoicism, or even Epicureanism, which we commonly think of as a pleasure-seeking philosophy. Even Epicureanism was wary of sex, believe it or not. Epicurus himself said this, sexual intercourse never helped anyone, and one must be satisfied if it is not harmed. In other words, the best you can expect out of sex is that it doesn't hurt you. You can never expect any kind of positive good from it. The best you can expect is no harm. Now, if you're listening to all of these pagan philosophers, and you're nodding your head and you're saying, yeah, that makes sense. This is what I'm talking about. We're in the Corinthian camp. If we're thinking this, I bring all of that up to show, first off, that it's not out of the ordinary for people in Corinth to hold these seemingly contradictory opinions about sex. Right? You could have had some of the very same people in Corinth who tolerated prostitution on the one hand, saying on the other hand, it's good for a man not to touch a woman. It's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. It seems contradictory to us today to say both of those things, but we've read Epictetus promoting both of those ideas. They didn't consider it contradictory. Stoic teachings, and in fact, to help maybe make a little more sense of why the Corinthians would go in for this kind of belief, Stoic teachings about sexual continence probably struck the Corinthian church as high-minded and moral, considering the perversity of other pagan philosophies like Cynicism or Greek Stoicism. Right? Greek and Roman Stoicism were worlds apart on sex. The Greeks were pretty loose. The Romans were relatively prudish. The Cynics were infamously loose. I won't go into any details. So I bring it up first off to explain this is how Corinth could hold both of these ideas at the same time. But I also bring all of this up because I suspect that many in our modern churches are sympathetic to these Roman Stoic ideas. Right? Just like with the theology of the body that we talked about last week, it is relatively common, I think, to find modern brothers and sisters in Christ firmly in the Corinthian camp, believing and teaching that misreading of the text that we talked about earlier. Right? That Paul is teaching from the Lord, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, and that marriage is given as a concession. Right? This is your, at best, second place trophy. Right? This is your silver medal. You weren't good enough to go for the gold and to control your sexual urges. So here's the consolation prize. You get a wife. Right? And we wonder why we have, problems with the genders not getting along or people not respecting each other. If you see your spouse as a consolation prize, I don't know, maybe that factors into it, you think? But again, I speak from my experience, having heard this passage been taught multiple times in churches of Christ, that there are a lot of us in the Corinthian camp on this, thinking that it is actually good for men and women not to have sex with each other, that sex is a plague, that it is a defeat, that it's indecent, that it should be minimized even within the context of marriage, that marital sex is at best a concession. Now, over and against what Corinth is saying, stands Paul. And Paul, and this is why I think that statement is the Corinthian position, the one that the ESV has placed in quotation marks. This is why I think that those quotation marks are a legitimate interpretation of the text, why I think that is the Corinthian position, because Paul responds with the scriptural pattern for the marriage bed. And as always, Paul brings Corinth back to the pattern of the cross, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But his response reveals that the Corinthians are creating problems for themselves, and that if we follow them, we're going to create exactly the same problems for ourselves. So what does Paul say? As we said earlier, the ESV obscures much of what Paul says. Because the ESV, first off, well, let's just read again what Paul says. But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. So, what do you think Paul means whenever he says each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband? Take a second and think about that. What does Paul mean when he says each man should have his own wife, and that each woman her own husband? What the ESV is making it sound like, and this is the way that I have heard it presented, is that Paul is saying that men and women should get married. since that's usually what we mean in English whenever we say that so-and-so has a wife or a husband. Right? We mean they're married. So we read each man should have his own wife, and we think what Paul is saying is men ought to get married. Right? If you've got problems with sexual temptation, you ought to get married. Each woman should have her own husband. Same thing goes for women, too. If you're having problems with sexual temptation, get married. Get yourself a husband. That's not what Paul is saying. That's not what Paul means. I want us to consider another translation of our text today. We're going to look at how the NIV renders our text today, because, and this doesn't happen often, right? I'm not an NIV hater like we sometimes have in the Churches of Christ, but I'm also not an NIV booster. I mean, it's kind of a mediocre translation one way or the other. But in this particular text, the NIV has done an excellent job, I think, capturing Paul's meaning in what he is trying to say. So we're going to reread today's text from the NIV. So let's turn again to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, the first 6 verses. Now, for the matters you wrote about, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman with her own husband. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband doesn't have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. Do not deprive each other, except perhaps by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. I say this as a concession, not as a command. Right. The problem is that Corinth says that it is good for a man not to have sex with a woman. Literally, that it is good for a man not to take hold of a woman, or not to lay hands on a woman, specifically his own wife. It is good for a man not to touch a woman. I think that's the way the King James renders it. It's good for a man not to take hold of a woman. Paul's answer is precisely the opposite. And this is why I'm convinced that that first statement, again, comes from Corinth and not from Paul. Because Paul, again, if we want to assume it's all from Paul, then over consecutive sentences, Paul says exactly the opposite things. Right? That first sentence says, it is good for a man not to take hold of a woman. Paul says, each man should hold his wife. Each woman should hold her own husband. Right? When the New Testament says that people should have or hold their spouse, we're to understand it in the same way as when the Old Testament talks about a husband and wife knowing each other. Right? We understand that whenever we hear, Abraham knew his wife, or Adam knew his wife, that they're talking about sex. The same thing is going on in the New Testament with having or holding a husband or wife. In fact, we could understand it really exactly the same way that we would understand these same words in the context of a country and western song. Right? If a country singer is talking about holding her man, you know that she's not just talking about hugging. That's what Paul is talking about here. He's contrasting these two together. And it doesn't come across clearly in the ESV at all, because they've botched the translation. It makes it sound like he's talking about two different things. That on the one hand, you have that it's good to not have sex, and on the other hand, well, because you have those temptations, you should get married. He's not talking about getting married in this passage. He is talking about husbands and wives having sex with each other. And the ESV has is rendered it that way, right? But since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, each woman with her own husband. That's Paul's answer. Married couples ought to have sex with each other. And this is the scriptural view of marriage, going all the way back to the garden. Remember, Paul is big on the scriptures. The whole New Testament is big on the scriptures. Remember why God created Eve to begin with. But we're told in Genesis chapter 2, what God himself says, it is not good for man to be alone. It's not good. That statement is the opposite of the Corinthian position. God says it is not good for a man to be alone. And in that very same text, Moses tells us the lesson that we are supposed to learn from that. Right? God observes it's not good for a man to be alone, and so he puts Adam to sleep. He takes the rib out, he fashions Eve, he presents Eve to Adam. Adam speaks the first poetry in human language whenever he sees Eve. I mean, the whole thing's... we could interpret it very romantically. That's neither here nor there. But Moses tells us at the end of the story, this is the point, right? Here's the lesson that you were supposed to learn from this story, the story that began with God saying, it is not good for a man to be alone. Here's the lesson. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife. There's that language again, by the way. It happens in the Old Testament, too. He should hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And then he finishes off with this further description of Adam and Eve. The man and his wife were both naked and not ashamed. All right, this is the scriptural norm from the beginning. Married couples have sex with each other. That's baked in. That's God's purpose, his intent in doing that. Whenever God was taking the rib out of Adam to fashion Eve, he purposed in his mind that this is the way that they should relate to each other. And that is why they're both naked and unashamed. That's why the lesson that we learn from it is that a man should leave his father and mother, cleave to his wife, the two shall become one flesh. That's the consequence of God looking at man and saying it's not good for him to be alone. Corinth, again, is telling us exactly the opposite. It's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, specifically his wife. Paul qualifies what that looks like, by the way. Whenever Moses is teaching us that, look, the norm of Scripture is that married couples have sex with each other, Paul qualifies what that looks like. He says, don't deprive one another, except perhaps for a limited time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. But then come back together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Right, and this, by the way, is what he concedes. Paul is not giving marriage as a concession. He's not giving marital sex as a concession. It is these brief periods of abstinence that he gives as a concession. Right? The command, the imperative is this: don't deprive one another. In other words, keep having sex. And again, we're talking husbands and wives here. This is the commandment that Paul gives. This is the imperative that he gives. Don't deprive one another. The concession that he gives is this. So remember, a concession is an exception. Right? Here's the norm, but knowing that you might not be able to meet the norm, or knowing that there are some other extenuating circumstances, here's what we're going to allow. Right? So here's the exception. Here's the concession. Except for prayer. And Paul says, look, that happens by agreement. Right? You both have to be on board with that. It happens for a limited time. In other words, don't just think that this is going to stretch out into eternity, right? You and your wife turn to each other one day, while you're in your, you can name the age. You and your wife turn to each other while you're in your 20s or in your 30s, your 40s or 50s, your 60s. And you say to each other, you know what? How about we live a life of prayerful contemplation until we die? Let's just stop having sex. No, that Paul says that's out. Right? This is a limited time thing that we're setting up here. You both agree to stop having sex with each other, but you cap that off. Then come back together again, Paul says, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. So the norm for a marriage relationship is regular sex. Now, Paul doesn't qualify things any more narrowly than that, right? What does regular mean? Right? And these are the kinds of fights that couples get into, right? What does regular mean? That requires discernment on the part of the couple. And again, that's already implied in what Paul says in his concession, right? That if you are, as a couple, if you're abstaining, it should be by agreement. It's something that you have to come together as a couple and figure out. So discernment is required for the couple. But that discernment, all right, here's where Paul narrows things down for us. Paul says that discernment is to be patterned after the cross. Because as he always does, Paul includes the pattern of the cross in his teaching. He doesn't mention the cross explicitly, but he mentions the pattern of the cross. We should recognize the kind of language that Paul uses here from what he's already said earlier in the letter. He says, the husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. This is the same message that Paul has been teaching to Corinth in all kinds of circumstances, just here applied to the context of marriage. All along in this letter, Paul has been saying, quit considering just yourself. Right? Quit being a narcissist, basically. Quit just thinking about your own needs and desires. Quit standing on your rights. Quit insisting, well, look, what I'm doing is permissible. Right? You remember earlier, all things are lawful. Paul holds up a different standard. Right? Not everything is beneficial, Paul says. The standard is you look for what's beneficial for the other person. Worry yourself about doing what is in the best interest of others. And here, specifically, it's your spouse. What's in my spouse's best interests? I want to shoot for that. Right, again, Paul's even using a lot of the same language here that he has used in previous chapters. It doesn't come across super clearly in English. It comes across more clearly in Greek. He's talking about, for example, having power or authority over things. He has talked about, excuse me, again, going back to that passage, all things are lawful, but not all things are profitable. All things are lawful, but I won't let anything control me. It's the same language there, the language of control. It's the same word in Greek that he's using in this text when he says, look, you don't have authority, that is power, over your own body. It belongs to your spouse. He uses some other language that he has used elsewhere in the letter, like talking about, here in this passage, he talks about depriving. Don't deprive one another. It's the same word that he used in the beginning of 1 Corinthians 6, in the lawsuit section, talking about defrauding people. Right? There is a sense in which when you just unilaterally decide, oh, I'm going to just completely, I'm going to not participate in one of the acts that marriage was designed for. Paul uses the language of defrauding in this passage. You are cheating your spouse in what you're doing. Everything is governed by this principle of the cross. Do what is best for the other person. Or in Jesus' own words, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. This pattern precludes all kinds of sexual selfishness. Right here, Paul is talking about people abstaining, depriving one another, but it's not just that. It's not limited to that. There are lots of ways to be sexually selfish. Right? Another common abuse, actually a very common abuse of this text, is to try to use 1 Corinthians 7 as a bludgeon to make demands of your spouse. I've seen it most commonly used by jilted husbands who feel like their wives are not putting out enough. And they'll bring up 1 Corinthians 7, right, like it's some kind of baseball bat that they can use to force their point, to make demands on their wives. That's not at all what Paul is writing this for, right? He doesn't just say, if you're in a marriage where you feel like you're not getting everything that you want or everything that you need, Paul is not just saying that your spouse's body belongs to you. He's also reminding you that your own body is not under your own authority. He's reminding you to get over yourself in some regard. In other words, come together as a couple and figure this out instead of making demands on each other. Likewise, he's not using this as some kind of excuse. That's another common abuse of this text. Right? Actually, I feel like I'm getting ahead of myself just a little bit. Because first, we need to consider, well, what happens when you ignore these things like Corinth has? Right? If Corinth is saying it's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, where does that take you? Well, here's the thing. In Corinth, we've already seen the consequences. And this is yet another thing the ESV kind of obscures. The ESV says, because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband, which sounds like a general warning that abstaining might create a temptation towards sexual immorality. And that's like 2 layers of maybe, right? It might create the temptation. The temptation might produce the sin. That's not what Paul says. He says, this is kind of a wooden translation of it in English. This is the way the King James translates it. Because of fornications, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The NIV, again, I think has captured the correct sense of this. But since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, each woman with her own husband. Paul is not pointing to a maybe in this text, at least not in the case of Corinth. He's pointing to things that are already going on in Corinth, things that we've already read about. This is the definite danger that you create for yourself and for your spouse when you neglect to have sex regularly. In fact, it's built into the text itself today, right? When he makes that concession, if you're going to deprive one another, do it by agreement for a limited time for the purpose of prayer, but come back together again, lest the adversary tempt you out of your lack of self-control. That's the danger. That's the danger of doing what Corinth has done. And we've seen it play out. In fact, there is a reason. Again, we said that just because Paul is addressing a letter now instead of addressing reports doesn't mean that he's changed topics any. There is a reason why he's talking about this here right now immediately after he has talked about their use of prostitutes in 1 Corinthians 6. Fornications were already going on in Corinth, and this is why. Because they've got it in their heads, again, possibly through soaking too much in Roman culture, they've got it in their heads that it is preferable to occasionally indulge with a prostitute than it is to regularly have sex with your own wife. That's the danger, ultimately, that you create for yourself and for your spouse whenever you ignore what Paul says here, is that you ramp up temptation. Because the adversary absolutely will take advantage of you and will take advantage of your spouse. Now, again, we have to understand this in light of the cross. Paul is not building in excuses into this passage. Whenever Paul warns, this is what's going to happen if you deny each other for too long, he is not excusing it. In other words, he's not excusing the fornication that happens. He is not saying, well, look, hiring prostitutes like we were just talking about, I know that that's bad, but you know what? That's understandable, right? You were hard up because, your spouses weren't doing what they were supposed to do. So, it's bad, but this kind of exculpates you of the guilt for that. No, Paul doesn't say that at all. He starts by condemning them of using prostitutes. He condemns that flat out. No ifs, ands, or buts. And then he turns his attention to this issue. People defrauding their spouses of what they're due. So, you don't get to use this as a bludgeon against your spouse. You don't get to use this as an excuse, a get out of sin free card, as it were. Sin is sin. And you don't have authority over your own body. Paul says, work it out. Okay? But what he teaches is that it is normative for married folks to regularly get together. So, Paul is going to offer in this chapter a lot of encouragement to all kinds of people, to married people as well as to unmarried people. He's going to show us, we've said that what's required in this passage is discernment. He's going to show us an even greater level of discernment that is required of us concerning the sorts of gifts that God gives us. That's going to be our topics over the next coming weeks. For this week, the call is simply those words of our Lord, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And if you are married, bear that in mind specifically in terms of your spouse. Do unto your spouse as you would have your spouse do unto you. As we said last week, don't buy into the world's false piety, because that's what this Roman Stoicism is. It's false piety. The Stoics looked like highly moral people. And in fact, Stoicism, specifically Roman Stoicism, is having something of a revival right now out in the unbelieving world. There are a lot of people who are picking up Seneca and who are picking up Marcus Aurelius and who are even picking up Epictetus and even to a lesser extent his teacher, Rufus. People are picking that back up. That's been within the last 5 years or so. It looks moral. It's not. It is a false piety. It's very similar to the kind of false piety that we saw out of the Pharisees. It's not godly to think of the body as evil and worthless, like we saw in the last chapter. It's not godly to think that sex is intrinsically evil and disordered, It's not godly to think those things because God created both of those things. God created the body. He raised our Lord, and he will also raise us up, Paul said. And God created us for each other. He created men and women for each other. He saw that it was not good for the man to be alone. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother, and hold to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. God created the body, and he created marriage for holiness and for righteousness. He created marital sex for holiness and for righteousness. So in everything that we do, let us live according to the pattern of the cross. If you're not currently living according to that pattern, if you have not given yourself to Jesus Christ, we encourage you to do that. Find a Church of Christ near you. If you are in St. Petersburg, Florida, or near there, we invite you to get in contact with us, the 14th Avenue Church of Christ. Wherever you go, speak to the members there, speak to the elders, speak to the preacher. Somebody there is going to be more than happy to teach you the way of Jesus Christ, what it means to be a Christian, to be a follower of Jesus. We invite you to become his disciple. Confess that first off, believe the good news that God has sent his Son to live among men. Turn away from the life of sin. Confess that Jesus is Lord, and be baptized into his death, burial, and resurrection for the remission of your sins. I want to thank you for joining us this week. Next week, we will continue further into 1 Corinthians chapter 7 as Paul expands out to talk about marriage more broadly, more generally. And he is going to talk about the decision-making process behind, we'll just say, changing your situation whenever it comes to marriage. So we look forward to seeing you then. Until next time, take care. Bye-bye.